The world trembles once again. In the midst of a decades-long conflict that seems to have no end, the issue of recognizing Palestine as a state has resurfaced on the international stage, this time with a louder echo than ever before. For generations, the Palestinian people have struggled to be recognized as an independent nation, a struggle marked by tears, blood, and unimaginable suffering. Now, several world leaders, particularly from Europe, have dared to take what many call a historic step, recognizing Palestine as a free and sovereign state. For the Palestinian people, this decision is not just a political gesture, but a long-awaited light of hope, a sign that the world is finally beginning to hear their cries and acknowledge their struggle. Yet on the other side, the move has sparked waves of controversy. Some view the recognition as reckless, like pouring gasoline on a fire that has already been burning for decades. They fear this recognition won't bring peace, but instead deepen the divide between Palestinians and Israelis, while further complicating diplomatic relations across nations. And so, a major question hangs in the air. Will this bold step truly open a path toward genuine peace? Or will it instead mark the beginning of yet another bloody chapter in the long, painful history of the Middle East? The world waits for the answer, holding its breath as history is once again being written right before our eyes. For decades, Palestine has stood as a symbol of struggle and the suffering of a nation without a state. From generation to generation, its people have lived under the shadow of conflict, stripped of their land, and denied the basic rights that every nation is entitled to. International support has continued to flow, whether through resolutions, humanitarian aid, or political statements. Yet Palestine's statehood has remained trapped in the tug-of-war of global interests, like a small pawn on the chessboard of international politics, moved around by the world's great powers. Recently, however, a historic step emerged from Europe. Countries such as Norway, Spain, and Ireland officially announced their recognition of Palestine as an independent state. This move was seen not merely as an ordinary diplomatic decision, but as a moral act of courage and acknowledgement of the suffering the Palestinian people have endured for decades. The announcement was welcomed with joy in many places, the streets of Palestine filled with cheers, prayers of gratitude, and tears of relief from those who, for so long, felt their voices had been ignored by the world. Yet behind this euphoria, a wave of strong criticism quickly followed. Opponents argued that the recognition was premature, even dangerous. They claimed that granting statehood legitimacy to Palestine while the conflict still rages could actually complicate the path toward peace. Some viewed it as a threat to regional stability, while others condemned it as a form of one-sided support that might undermine ongoing peace negotiations. In the end, this bold decision by European nations became a double-edged sword, on one hand offering a glimmer of hope, but on the other reigniting the flames of an endless debate. Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, once again made headlines with his signature bold and controversial tone. This time, he turned his attention to the decision made by several European leaders who recently recognized Palestine as an independent state. For Trump, this step is not a path to peace, but a grave mistake that could drag the world into even deeper conflict. With his sharp and uncompromising rhetoric, he called the recognition a dangerous gift to militant groups that have long operated in the region. In his view, granting state legitimacy to Palestine would not resolve the underlying problems. On the contrary, he argued it would only strengthen the position of Hamas and other armed factions, which many see as threats to regional stability. Trump stressed that the world must not forget who the key actors are behind this long-standing battle, and how these groups often exploit the suffering of the people to expand their influence. For him, Europe's move was a display of political naivete that could ultimately lead to greater losses in the future. Trump further insisted that true peace can only be achieved through direct negotiations between Palestine and Israel, not through unilateral decisions, not through forced international pressure, and certainly not through symbolic recognition that, in his eyes, brings no real change on the ground. He compared this recognition to building a house on sand. It might look strong on the surface, but the foundation is weak, and it could collapse at the slightest tremor. With the fiery rhetoric that has become his trademark, Trump warned that this decision could spark broader instability not only in the already fragile Middle East, but also within the global diplomatic order. He raised concerns about a domino effect. If more countries follow suit, tensions between the world's major blocs could escalate. Nations that have long stood by Israel might feel betrayed, while those supporting Palestine would become even more emboldened to take a harder stance. Trump even went so far as to liken the situation to opening Pandora's box. Once it is opened, the consequences cannot be controlled. Instead of bringing peace, such recognition could unleash a new wave of violence, fuel acts of terror, and spread conflict into regions that were not directly involved before. He reminded the world that history has shown time and again every hasty decision in the Middle East has prolonged suffering rather than ended it. In the end, through his commanding voice, Trump sought to hammer home one central point: the road to peace cannot be imposed from the outside, nor can it be built on political gestures that only satisfy one side. According to him, the only way forward is through the negotiating table, where Palestinians and Israelis sit down face to face and have the courage to make the difficult choices for the future of their people. Until that happens, Trump warned, the world should brace itself for a new wave of turmoil potentially larger than anything it has faced before. In a tone as forceful as Donald Trump's, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also raised his voice with unyielding conviction. Standing before the glare of cameras at a tense press conference, he declared that the decision by some European leaders to recognize Palestine as an independent state was nothing short of a grave mistake. With a stern expression and words heavy with emphasis, Netanyahu accused that such recognition was not a path to peace, but rather a gift to terrorism, according to him. This decision does not bring the world any closer to a solution. Instead, it pushes further away the fragile hope of stability in the Middle East. Netanyahu stressed that the move would only breathe new life into groups that have long sought the destruction of Israel. He mentioned Hamas by name, warning that recognition of Palestine would strengthen the very hands of those who reject Israel's existence as a nation. In his view, countries offering recognition are willfully ignoring the harsh reality Israelis endure every single day: the wail of air raid sirens, the sudden threat of rockets streaking across the sky, and the looming shadow of terror that haunts ordinary life. With unwavering determination, Netanyahu cautioned that Israel would not remain passive. He declared boldly that his nation would fight every international attempt that sought to weaken or undermine its standing. Israel will not bow to pressure, and we will not stand idle in the face of threats that attempt to erode our sovereignty, he proclaimed. His words echoed not only across Israel, but into the wider international arena, serving as a stark warning that Israel intends to remain at the front lines against what it perceives as unjust interventions. Going further, Netanyahu sought to flip the global narrative. He reminded the world that recognizing Palestine was not merely a diplomatic gesture, but a dangerous political message. In his eyes, every such recognition meant disregarding the suffering of the Israeli people who, for years, have lived under the looming specter of bombings, rocket attacks, and relentless terror. Those who recognize Palestine, he said, raising his voice, are essentially giving their support to terrorism. The room fell silent for a moment after his words, before they ignited heated debates across the globe. Netanyahu's remarks drew an even deeper dividing line between the nations that back Palestine and Israel's strongest allies, especially the United States. For him, this was not merely about international politics, it was about the very survival of the Israeli people. He painted the picture that every seemingly simple decision abroad, even a symbolic recognition, carried immediate consequences for the security of millions of Israelis. In this way, Netanyahu sought to underscore that Europe's recognition of Palestine was not an act of harmless diplomacy, but a tangible threat to peace and stability itself. On the other side of the global stage, however, a very different voice emerged, one that stood in stark contrast to the fiery rhetoric of Trump and Netanyahu. From across Europe, leaders who had just announced their official recognition of Palestine delivered a message that carried both moral weight and historical conviction. Their recognition, they insisted, was not a gesture of support for militant groups, nor could it ever be equated with an endorsement of terrorism. Instead, it was a moral declaration, a stand taken on behalf of the Palestinian people, whose lives have been defined for decades by blockade, displacement, and the haunting reality of growing up without ever knowing the true meaning of peace. To these European leaders, the recognition of Palestine was not a hollow diplomatic formality. It was an affirmation of rights so fundamental they could no longer be denied: the right to freedom, the right to a homeland, and the right to live in peace without the shackles of occupation or oppression. They spoke with clarity and conviction, framing their decision as not only brave but historic. They knew full well that fierce criticism would follow, and that political pressure might come from some of Israel's most powerful allies. Yet they believed that history itself would remember this moment not as a reckless gamble, but as a turning point. Spain stood at the forefront of this movement, voicing its stance with striking clarity. Its leaders declared that peace could never be achieved if only one side was recognized as legitimate, while the other was constantly dismissed and sidelined. True peace, they insisted, could only exist when two nations stood on equal footing: Israel and Palestine, both acknowledged, both respected. Without such recognition, the negotiating table would remain hopelessly uneven. Israel, armed with overwhelming military strength and supported by powerful international allies, would always dominate. Palestine, on the other hand, would continue to be cast as the weaker party, treated as a mere guest in discussions about its own destiny.